Have you ever received something so simple, so innocent, so beautifully packaged, only to learn later it carried a darkness you never imagined was meant for you? On the morning of my 69th birthday, I woke with a softness in my chest, a kind of quiet disbelief that another year had arrived, gently, without fanfare, without the voice I still sometimes expected to hear in the kitchen making coffee for two. Widowhood had reshaped every corner of my life, leaving me with shadows where conversations used to live and silence where laughter once bloomed. And yet, birthdays still carried a strange glow, bittersweet, yes, but meaningful. They were reminders that I was still here, still breathing, still choosing to rise from the bed, even when loneliness pressed harder on some days than others. So when the doorbell rang just after sunrise, I didn't expect anything extraordinary. But there it was on my porch, a beautifully wrapped box tied with satin ribbon, elegant and thoughtful, the kind of gift you imagine being chosen with care. The card read, "From your son." My heart dipped and then lifted, a fragile swell of warmth spreading through me. He remembered. Despite the distance between us, emotional, not geographical, he had remembered. It's strange how a small gesture can make you forget years of disappointment and cling to hope like it's brand new. I carried the box inside as though it were delicate, precious, symbolic, and in a way it was. My son and I had drifted so slowly over the years that I often wondered if the version of him I missed was simply a memory I'd polished too much. But this gift, this birthday surprise felt like an olive branch, like a whisper of the boy he once was, the boy who brought me daisies from the backyard and declared they were better than store flowers because they're free. Maybe, just maybe, he was finding his way back to me. When I lifted the lid, the scent of rich, dark chocolate floated upward. Luxurious pieces arranged in perfect rows, each one topped with a delicate swirl, a dusting of gold, a hint of something elegant. It was the kind of chocolate you buy for someone you love, someone important, someone worth spoiling. And I felt foolishly, beautifully cherished. My chest tightened with something that felt like gratitude, something I had longed for without admitting it. I imagined eating one quietly later that night with a cup of tea, savoring the gift like a small, personal celebration. But when my daughter-in-law and grandchildren stopped by unexpectedly that afternoon, the gift transformed from a moment alone to a moment shared. I looked at the little faces lighting up at the sight of the box on the counter, their eyes big and hopeful. How could I resist? I had never been the kind of grandmother who hoarded treats or clung to gifts selfishly. My heart was soft, always had been. If joy could be shared, I shared it. So I passed the chocolates around, one to my daughter-in-law, two to the children, one for myself. I decided to save for later. They giggled as the chocolate melted on their tongues, happiness spreading across their faces in sticky little smiles. And for a moment, standing in my kitchen surrounded by laughter and warmth, I felt something tender unfolding inside me. Maybe this birthday would be different. Maybe this would be the year my family found its way back to each other. Hope has a way of painting over the cracks, doesn't it? Even when the cracks are deeper than we know. The shift came quietly at first, a small wrinkle of confusion in my daughter-in-law's brow, a subtle tremble in her hand as she set down her teacup. One of the children complained of a stomachache, and then the other, and then she herself doubled over with a sudden sharp gasp. The laughter evaporated, the warmth vanished, and my kitchen transformed from a place of celebration into a place of fear. Within minutes they were pale, sweating, trembling. My heart pounded in my chest as panic surged through me. I called for help, my voice cracking with terror, my hands shaking so wildly I could barely press the numbers. The paramedics arrived quickly, flooding my small home with urgency and questions I couldn't yet comprehend. Did they eat anything unusual? How long ago? Did anyone else consume the chocolates? I opened my mouth to speak and found the words tangled in my throat. What had I done? Tears blurred my vision as I stammered out the only truth I had. They were a gift from my son. I thought they were safe. Guilt is a merciless creature. It sinks its claws into you long before you understand what you're guilty of. At the hospital, machines beeped, nurses rushed, doctors murmured words like toxin, reaction, stabilize. My daughter-in-law's face twisted with pain. The children whimpered, their small bodies trembling under blankets. And I sat beside them, hollowed by guilt, repeating the same silent prayer over and over. Please let them be okay. Please let them be okay. I would have given anything in that moment, my home, my savings, whatever remained of my health, just to rewind time and eat those chocolates myself, to take their suffering into my own body. Because surely a birthday gift couldn't be dangerous. Surely my son wouldn't send something harmful. Surely there was another explanation. But then the doctor approached, his face lined with concern. The chocolates contained arsenic, he said gently, as if softening the blow would change the truth. Arsenic. Poison. The word echoed inside me like a scream trapped behind glass. Poison meant for whom? Poison prepared by whom? Poison sent by the person whose name was still on the silver ribbon now sitting discarded on my kitchen table. And as my breath caught in my chest, the doctor asked the question that split my world open. Mrs. Carter, did you eat any yourself? I shook my head slowly. No, I whispered. I gave them to my family instead. And in that terrible silence, a cold realization wrapped itself around my heart. Those chocolates weren't meant to hurt them, they were meant to kill me. What would you do if the moment meant to celebrate your life instead forced you to question whether someone wanted it to end? The hospital waiting room smelled of antiseptic, fear, and that faint metallic scent that clings to places where lives hang in the balance. I sat there with my hands shaking in my lap, still stained with traces of melted chocolate from when the children had hugged me before collapsing. The fluorescent lights above flickered in a rhythm that made time feel fractured, as if every second stretched painfully long before snapping suddenly into the next. Nurses moved with purposeful strides, doctors consulted charts, machines hummed and beeped, and yet, in the middle of all this motion, I felt like a statue carved out of shock. My daughter-in-law had been wheeled into another room. The children were on IV drips, monitors chirped with mechanical concern. And I, the woman who had once believed turning 69 was simply another quiet milestone, found myself sitting on a hospital bench trying to understand how a gift of chocolate turned into an emergency that might alter the course of our entire lives. Nothing makes you question the world faster than realizing the danger you feared least is the danger you welcomed into your own home. Every few minutes, my mind replayed the moment the doctor said, arsenic, the sound of it, the heaviness of it, the absurd cruelty of it. Arsenic belonged in crime documentaries and history books, not in birthday boxes from your only child. But the truth refused to soften. I felt its edges cutting deeper with every breath. How could this happen? Where did it come from? Why were the children suffering because of something meant for me? The guilt curled around my ribs like barbed wire. I should have tasted one first. I should have thrown the chocolates away. I should have questioned why my son sent them instead of visiting. I should have. The chorus of self-blame drowned out every logical thought, leaving me choking on guilt that wasn't even mine to carry. But that's what motherhood does. It forces you to bear the weight of every outcome, even when someone else planted the seeds of destruction. A nurse approached, her face careful and composed, the kind of expression designed to hide the storm beneath. She sat beside me gently, her uniform brushing against my sweater. The children are responding, she said softly. Your daughter-in-law as well. We're doing everything we can. Relief hit me so forcefully it made me dizzy. My hands flew to my face as I inhaled sharply, a sob slipping out before I could contain it. They were alive. Alive. The gift meant to kill hadn't succeeded because I made the simple, innocent choice to share it. A choice rooted in love. A choice that accidentally saved my life. It's terrifying how often survival comes disguised as a small, everyday decision you don't even remember making. But relief quickly twisted into something else, dread. Because if the chocolates contained arsenic, someone had put it there, Deliberately, purposefully. This wasn't an accident or a contamination or a factory error. This was intent. Human intent. I checked my phone, half expecting missed calls or worried texts. Nothing. Not a single message, not even a question asking if I'd received the chocolates. My heart trembled under the weight of that silence. Why hadn't he contacted me? Why wasn't he here? Why did he send the gift instead of visiting? Why had he insisted, during our last conversation, that I take time for myself on my birthday instead of spending it with family? Every unanswered question lit a new spark of fear in my chest. A doctor approached again, holding a clipboard, his expression tight. "Mrs. Carter, we need to ask you some questions," he said, and I nodded numbly. The questions were clinical at first, simple details about the chocolates, when they were eaten, how many pieces, who ate what. But then the doctor hesitated, glancing at the nurse before adding, "Did you feel unwell at all after handling the chocolates? Headache? Dizziness?" "No," I replied. "Did you eat any yourself?" Again I shook my head. He exchanged a look with the nurse. "So only your daughter-in-law and grandchildren consumed them." Something shifted in the air, a subtle tension, a thickening of silence. I nodded again, my breath shallow. The doctor knelt slightly, lowering the clipboard. "Mrs. Carter, arsenic poisoning in these amounts is almost always deliberate." Deliberate. The word landed like a blow to my sternum. Deliberate meant targeted. Deliberate meant planned. Deliberate meant the chocolates were intended for one specific person. A wave of cold ran down my spine, chilling every memory I held of my son, his birth, his first steps, the day he graduated, the afternoon he wept on my shoulder during his divorce. The idea that he could, no, the idea that anyone could, send poison into my home felt too monstrous to grasp. So my mind rebelled. It searched desperately for alternative explanations, tampering at the factory, a malicious stranger, a mistake. But each possibility shattered against the facts. The chocolates came with a handwritten card. My son's handwriting. His signature flourish on the Y of happy birthday. The flavor I loved most, dark chocolate with raspberry. The expensive brand he knew I adored. Poison doesn't reach your doorstep by accident when it arrives, wearing familiarity like a mask. I stared at the sterile tiles beneath my feet. Each tile a perfect square, each one identical, each one reflecting the truth I didn't want to see. Someone wanted me dead. Someone close enough to know my tastes, my habits, my birthday. Someone who didn't expect me to share the chocolates. Someone who believed I would eat them alone. Someone who signed the box with the word love. My stomach twisted violently, not from poison, but from betrayal. But even then, a part of me resisted the possibility. He was my son, my only child, the boy I raised with gentle hands, the man I defended too many times, the person I made excuses for. Surely he wouldn't. But then why wasn't he here? Why hadn't he called? Why did he send a gift instead of visiting? Why did the box contain death dressed as sweetness? Just then, the nurse returned. "Your daughter-in-law is awake," she said. "She's asking for you." And as I stood to go to her room, a chilling truth followed me like a shadow. If I didn't discover who put arsenic in those chocolates, the next time I might not survive the mistake. What if the truth you fear the most doesn't scream, but reveals itself in quiet, fractured moments that feel wrong long before you understand why? When I walked into my daughter-in-law's hospital room, the air felt thick with the sterile smell of medicine and the weight of things unspoken. She lay propped up against a stack of pillows, still pale, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for a cup of water. But when her eyes met mine, panic flickered across her face, not distrust, not blame, but something else, something closer to fear. She grabbed my hand with a grip far too strong for someone recovering from arsenic poisoning, and for a moment we simply looked at each other, two women connected by the same trauma but unable to voice the darkest possibility whispering between us. The poison wasn't random, it wasn't an accident, and it wasn't meant for her. Sometimes the deepest truths pass silently between hearts before they ever form into words. She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, the doctor returned and asked for privacy to run more tests. I stepped back into the hallway, my legs unsteady from the emotional tension still vibrating through me. I should have felt relieved that she was awake and stable. I should have been able to breathe easier knowing the children were responding to treatment. But instead, an uneasy heaviness pressed on my chest as if some greater danger lingered just outside my field of vision. I sank into a chair by the window, watching streaks of afternoon light stretch across the linoleum, my mind replaying every moment from the past 24 hours. The chocolate, their collapse, my empty bite, the doctor's questions, the nurse's hesitation, and the most jarring of all, my son's silence, a void louder than any siren. My phone vibrated, startling me from my thoughts. A message notification from my son flashed across the screen. "Hope you're having a nice birthday. Enjoy the chocolates." He sent it hours after they became poisoned, hours after the ambulance, hours after the hospital admitted them. Hours after I called him 3 times with no answer. The message wasn't delayed. It was scheduled, automated. My breath caught in my throat. Who schedules a birthday greeting? Who plans affection? Who thinks to send a message matching the timing of a gift unless they want the timeline to appear seamless and innocent? Love doesn't require choreography. Deceit does. My fingers shook as I lowered the phone. The hollowness I felt earlier deepened into something I didn't want to acknowledge, suspicion. But the truth didn't care whether I wanted it or not. It pushed through anyway, blooming in my chest like a bruise spreading beneath fragile skin. I needed answers. And answers weren't going to come from waiting in a hallway. When the doctor stepped out again, I asked if my daughter-in-law could have visitors. He nodded gently and gestured for me to enter. Her eyes lifted the moment she saw me, and there was a rawness there, a conflict, a struggle, a decision she hadn't fully made yet. I sat beside her, clasping her cold hands in mine. We didn't need words to acknowledge the fear threading between us. But then she whispered something that rattled me to my core. "You weren't supposed to give them to us." The room seemed to tilt. She didn't elaborate, but she didn't need to. The implication tightened around my lungs like invisible fingers. She knew something. Or she suspected the same thing I did. And the sickening part was how naturally her statement fit into the questions clawing through my mind. I swallowed hard, unable to speak as a nurse entered to adjust her IV, ending the moment abruptly. I stepped out of the room, dazed, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The hallway felt longer than before, every footstep echoing with a history I hadn't yet pieced together. Why did my daughter-in-law say that? Why did she look terrified before speaking? Why did she stop when the nurse walked in? Why did her fear seem directed at someone who wasn't in the room? I moved toward the waiting area and collapsed into a chair, rubbing my temples as if pressure alone could organize the chaos inside my mind. Then came the memory, small, insignificant at the time, but now cutting through me like a blade. A week ago, my son had called late at night. He sounded distracted, impatient, oddly pushy. He insisted I update my emergency documents, emphasized how important it was to have everything in order, and asked again if I'd considered making him executor. He brought up my will, something he rarely mentioned, then casually pressed the issue of my life insurance. At the time, I chalked it up to grief, stress, adulthood responsibilities. But now that conversation felt like a thread leading somewhere much darker. The puzzle pieces of betrayal rarely come in order. They scatter across memory and fall into place only when the final danger reveals itself. I opened my purse and pulled out the ribbon from the chocolate box. It was smooth, expensive, intentionally chosen. The kind of box you'd research, customize, personalize. The chocolates weren't a last-minute gift. They were curated, planned, thought out. And suddenly, the sweetness of the gesture transformed into a calculated kind of horror. Someone had planned to kill me with something I loved on the day I was most vulnerable, disguised as affection. My stomach turned violently at the realization. I needed more than suspicion. I needed proof. And proof often hides in the places where intentions leak through: emails, receipts, financial trails. I walked back to my daughter-in-law's room to retrieve her phone at her request. She said the doctors needed to give it to her, or so she'd been told. But when I stepped inside, something unexpected happened. She reached toward me weakly and whispered, "Look in his office. You'll understand." Her eyes glistened, not with accusation, but with warning, like someone who'd seen something she wasn't supposed to see. Her voice faded as exhaustion overtook her. But those words, they lodged themselves into my mind like arrows pointing in one direction, my son's home office. The place he guarded more fiercely than his own privacy. The place he insisted wasn't organized enough for visitors. The place he always kept locked. Something was waiting for me there, something that would explain the poison, the silence, the fear in my daughter-in-law's eyes, something that would break my heart or save my life, or both. And as I left the hospital that night, one thought pulsed louder than the rest. Whatever truth lived inside my son's office was about to rewrite everything I believed about family. What if the person you trusted most wasn't just hiding secrets, but building a future where you no longer existed? Driving home from the hospital felt like entering a different world, one where shadows, whispered warnings, and memories suddenly rearranged themselves into sinister shapes. The night air clung to my skin as though trying to ground me, but my mind was scattered, spiraling through fragments of conversations I had dismissed as stress, exhaustion, or ordinary family tension. I parked in my driveway and stared at my house, the place where I once baked birthday cakes, where pictures lined every hallway, where my son grew from a toddler stumbling through the backyard to a young man dreaming of independence. That same house now looked unfamiliar, like a stage where a story had been unfolding behind closed curtains, and I was only now discovering I'd been the only one in the audience who didn't know the script. Home feels different when you realize it might hold the evidence of a betrayal crafted inside your own bloodline. My heart pounded as I unlocked the front door. The silence inside wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, suspicious, charged. The house seemed to watch me as I walked through it, each step a reminder of how blind I had been to the signs that something was wrong. I headed toward my son's office at the end of the hallway, a room he had always guarded with territorial intensity. He used to joke it was his command center, but there had been moments, small ones, when I'd sensed an edge in his tone if someone lingered too close to the door. At the time, I told myself it was because he valued privacy. Now, fear twisted his old excuses into red flags I had overlooked. The door was locked. Of course it was, but fear sharpens instincts, and I remembered a spare key he hid behind a painting in the hallway. A strange place to hide a key to his own office in my house. My fingers trembled as I slid the painting aside and pulled out the small silver key taped to the back. For a moment I hesitated, afraid of what opening the door might mean. Because once truth reveals itself, you can never return to ignorance. But ignorance nearly cost me my life. So I pushed the key into the lock. The door opened with a soft click. The room inside was colder than the rest of the house, as if the secrets it carried had stolen the warmth from the air. Papers lay scattered across the desk, receipts peeked from drawers left slightly ajar, and a faint chemical odor tickled my nose. I stepped inside slowly, careful not to disturb anything. My eyes scanned the room for anything that might connect my son to the poisoned chocolates. At first, nothing seemed unusual, just the cluttered mess of someone whose life had become too tangled. But then I saw it. A crumpled receipt shoved beneath a stack of envelopes. The logo on the top wasn't from a grocery store or a bakery. It was from a specialty chemical supplier, a place that sold compounds not found in any everyday household. My stomach flipped as my eyes traced the list of items purchased. One stood out in bold, unmistakable letters: arsenic trioxide. There is a moment when denial dies, and in its place rises a grief so fierce it shakes you to your knees. I backed away from the desk, my breath coming in shallow bursts. My son! The boy I raised, the man I loved, had bought arsenic, not by mistake, not unknowingly, deliberately, purposefully. He had placed it inside chocolate sent to me with a ribbon and a card, a birthday gift that hid death beneath glossy swirls of cocoa. My knees weakened as I sank into the chair at the corner of the room. Tears blurred my vision, not the soft, steady tears of sadness, but the violent kind that come when betrayal cracks open your heart. I wondered how long he had planned it. Weeks, months. Had he looked me in the eye while calculating my absence? Had he hugged me goodbye knowing he intended to poison me? The cruelty of it hollowed me in ways I didn't know I could break. As my breathing steadied, another thought pushed through the fog. Why? What reason could justify killing your own mother? The answer drifted toward me like a shadow I already recognized. Money, inheritance, desperation. The late-night phone call returned to me now with chilling clarity. His sudden interest in my will, the urgency in his voice, the pressure to get paperwork sorted. I had interpreted it as concern. But now, under the harsh light of truth, I could see it for what it was, preparation. He wanted my estate, my assets, everything I had built with my late husband. He didn't want to wait for life to run its natural course. He wanted control, power, wealth. Immediately. I rose from the chair, feeling older than my years, and opened the top drawer of his desk. Inside was another envelope, this one thick, with handwritten notes, financial statements, and a drafted letter to a lawyer requesting urgent assistance in transferring property titles after the unexpected passing of my mother. My name was spelled correctly, the date was blank, he was waiting for the right moment to fill it in. My breath hitched painfully. This wasn't impulse, this was strategy. A blueprint for my death disguised as responsibility. As I sifted through the papers, one final detail nearly shattered me completely. He had recently increased the life insurance policy under my name, listing himself as the sole beneficiary. The amount was large, too large. Enough to wipe out all his debts, enough to give him a fresh start, enough to erase the financial mess he had buried himself in. My death was supposed to be his freedom. My life was simply the obstacle standing in his way. I pressed a hand to my mouth, stifling a sob. My son, my only son, had looked at my love, my sacrifices, my existence, and seen nothing but dollar signs. I left his office trembling, feeling like a ghost wandering through my own house. The walls, once filled with memories, now felt like silent witnesses to a crime in progress. My mind raced with questions I didn't want to ask. Would he try again? Would he come to the hospital pretending to care? Would he blame the factory? Would he manipulate the story to protect himself? I reached for my phone and dialed the one person who could help me navigate this nightmare, the lawyer who had assisted my husband years ago with estate documents. My voice trembled as I left a message, but beneath the fear, a spark of resolve ignited. If my son wanted to remove me from my own life, then I would remove him from my future. Because in the moment I learned my son had planned my death, I promised myself one thing. I may have been his target, but I would never again be his victim. What do you do when the person threatening your life shares your blood, and the only way to survive is to expose the one you once protected? By the time I stepped outside the house, the night air felt sharper than before, as if the world itself had shifted into a colder, unfamiliar place. I held the stack of papers, receipts, drafts, and chemical purchase records against my chest like they were pieces of a life I no longer recognized. My life, dismantled and rearranged into evidence. Evidence of intent. Evidence of a truth so monstrous I almost couldn't bear to hold it. The porch light flickered behind me, casting trembling shadows across the yard, shadows that felt like echoes of every moment I had misread, every warning I had dismissed, every instinct I'd silenced because mothers are taught to love without limits. But love without limits becomes a weapon when the person you love decides to test them. I drove to the lawyer's office the next morning with a numbness coating my thoughts. Sunlight streamed through the windshield, warm and golden, mocking the chaos swirling inside me. How could sunlight exist on a day like this? How could the world continue turning while mine teetered on the edge of a truth I never wanted to see? The radio played softly, voices chatting about weather forecasts, traffic updates, and a charity event happening downtown. Everyday things. Things that belonged to a life where chocolates weren't poison and suns weren't predators. But that life was gone now, replaced by a reality where survival meant choosing courage over comfort. When I walked into the law office, the receptionist's kind eyes softened at the sight of me. I must have looked like someone carrying the weight of a collapsed universe. Within minutes, I was sitting across from the lawyer, Howard, who had helped my husband and me decades ago. His hair was greyer now, his glasses thicker, but his voice remained steady, anchoring. He didn't rush me, he didn't interrupt, he simply let the silence stretch until I found the strength to break it. And when I finally did, the words spilled out, not like a confession, but like a dam bursting. Everything. The chocolates, the hospital, the arsenic, the locked office, the receipts, the insurance policy, the drafted letters, the automated birthday message, the entire tapestry of deceit my son had woven while I remained blind. Howard listened without judgment, his expression tautening with each detail. When I finished, he leaned back slowly and exhaled. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "this wasn't desperation, this was premeditated." The word reverberated inside me like a bell tolling for something sacred. Premeditated, planned, intentional. Not a moment of madness, not a mistake, a decision. My son had made a decision to kill me. Shock didn't pierce me anymore. It settled, heavy and inevitable, like rain soaking into earth that can no longer repel it. Howard explained the legal parameters, the criminal charges, the financial fraud implications, the potential police involvement, the process of securing restraining orders, freezing access to assets, and alerting insurance companies before my son attempted to claim anything. It was overwhelming, terrifying, and yet strangely empowering. For the first time in months, maybe years, I wasn't reacting to my son's choices, I was making my own. He collected the evidence carefully, placing each document into a folder with meticulous precision, as though handling something fragile. I watched him secure the folder with a quiet gratitude I didn't have the words to express. This man was helping me gather the pieces of a life shattered not by strangers, but by the person I once rocked to sleep. There is no pain sharper than realizing the child you protected grows into an adult you need protection from. After documenting everything, Howard gently asked, "Do you have a safe place to stay?" And for the first time I realized I didn't. My home was compromised, not because my son lived there, but because his intentions had seeped into its walls, turning it into a battlefield disguised as a memory. If he learned the chocolates hadn't killed me, or worse, that I had found the evidence he hid, he might try again. The thought chilled me to the bone. He had already proven he could. He had already proven he wanted to. Howard helped arrange an emergency relocation through a senior support network that assisted victims of family exploitation, an organization I never imagined I'd need. They found a temporary apartment for me, quiet and discreet, away from familiar streets. The thought of leaving my home felt like swallowing broken glass, but staying was no longer an option. Survival required distance. Returning home only long enough to pack a single duffel bag was surreal. I moved quickly, taking only essentials, medication, clothes, documents, my late husband's wedding band, a photograph of the children before their innocence was stolen by someone else's actions. I avoided my son's office. I avoided the kitchen. I avoided anything that reminded me of the life I had lived before. The truth came crashing in. When I closed the front door behind me, I expected to feel grief. Instead, I felt resolve, a quiet, steady flame that burned not with vengeance, but with reclamation. I wasn't running away. I was stepping forward into clarity, into strength, into self-preservation. In the safe apartment, the silence was different. Not frightening, not heavy, just quiet. Like a pause between two very different chapters. I sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed, clutching the photograph of my grandchildren, and whispered a promise to myself, "This ends with justice, not excuses." My son had no idea his plan had collapsed, no idea I was alive because of a simple act of generosity, no idea I was building a case with every breath. No idea I had risen from the ashes of his betrayal with more strength than he ever imagined I possessed. Because once a mother stops protecting the child who tried to destroy her, she becomes unstoppable. What happens when the person who tried to end your life discovers you're still alive and no longer afraid of him? The next morning arrived with a heavy sky, the kind that seemed to sag under the weight of unsaid truths. I woke in the small apartment the senior support network had arranged for me, a place so quiet it felt almost sacred. For the first time in days, my body wasn't coiled with tension the moment my eyes opened. Instead, a stillness washed over me, strange, new, unfamiliar. A stillness not born from peace, but from purpose. I wasn't hiding from my son. I wasn't fleeing. I was preparing to expose him, preparing to sever whatever remained of the maternal bond he had exploited, preparing to reclaim every piece of my life he had tried to steal with a single box of poisoned chocolates. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it awakens in the quiet moments when you decide you deserve to live. Howard called at 9 a.m. sharp. His voice held a mixture of reassurance and gravity as he informed me the police had received the evidence. They would be reviewing everything that day: receipts, chemical purchases, life insurance documents, drafts of fraudulent letters, even the chocolate box itself. I felt a tremor run through me, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that this nightmare was finally shifting into the hands of people who could dismantle it legally, piece by piece. The law wasn't fast, but it was deliberate. But as the hours passed, a new anxiety crept in, the fear of what my son might do when he realized I hadn't died. Until now, he believed his plan had succeeded or was in progress. He didn't know the chocolates were never eaten by me. He didn't know the hospital had run toxicology tests. He didn't know I had fled the house with evidence. He didn't know I had uncovered every thread of his scheme. He didn't know the police were involved. And the most dangerous kind of person is the one who thinks they've succeeded right before they learn they've failed. A predator is never more desperate than when cornered by the truth he tried to bury. The man who had tried to murder me, the man who had texted an automated birthday message while his poisoned chocolates nearly killed his own children. My hand froze, hovering above the phone. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Not emotionally, not strategically. Instead, I watched as the notifications piled up. Missed call! Missed call! Missed call! A new message preview appeared. Mom, please call me. Something's wrong. Something was wrong, yes. But not in the way he meant. I placed the phone face down on the blanket, refusing to read more. The truth was no longer mine to wrestle with in silence. It was in the hands of professionals now. By evening, there was a knock on my apartment door. For a heartbeat, panic seized me. I imagined him standing there, frantic, enraged, demanding to know why I wasn't answering. But when I peered through the peephole, relief flooded me. It was Howard. He stepped inside, his expression somber but steady. "They're moving forward," he said. "The detectives have what they need to bring him in for questioning. It won't be long now." I exhaled shakily, tears pooling in my eyes. Not tears of weakness, tears of release, tears that carried months, maybe years, of pent-up ache from loving someone who saw my life as currency rather than connection. Howard explained that the police would begin with a welfare inquiry, using the hospital report as a legitimate entry point into an investigation. Then they'd confront him with the evidence we'd provided. If he tried to lie, the documents would unravel his story. If he tried to manipulate, the toxicology results would expose him. If he tried to play innocent, the insurance records would contradict him. And if he attempted to flee, well, they were prepared for that too. The strongest case isn't built from vengeance, it's built from truth that refuses to stay buried. As night settled over the apartment, I sat by the window, watching the city lights shimmer against the darkening sky. My mind drifted back to the early years of motherhood, to the small hand that clung to mine, to the scraped knees I bandaged, to the birthday parties I spent hours planning just to see him smile, to the bedtime stories I read until my voice cracked. It felt surreal, intolerable even, that the same child I once protected from every danger had grown into the danger itself. But somewhere inside me, a quiet acceptance formed. Loving someone doesn't prevent them from choosing darkness. It only makes the betrayal hurt more. And forgiveness wasn't part of this story. Accountability was. Then, unexpectedly, my daughter-in-law called. Her voice was frail but steady. She told me she remembered something she hadn't shared yet. A comment my son had made weeks earlier about life-changing soon. Something about not having to wait much longer. At the time, she interpreted it as excitement over a new job opportunity. Now, through the lens of survival, it sounded chillingly different. I listened as she apologized through tears, apologizing for him, for herself, for not seeing what he had been planning right under her nose. I told her none of this was her burden to carry. The guilt belonged only to the man who orchestrated the harm. She whispered, "I'm with you. Whatever happens next, you're not alone." And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the faint warmth of unexpected companionship, an emotional hand held out in a moment when I least expected it. As the night deepened, an officer contacted me directly. They were heading to speak with Robert. The case was in motion. Justice had stepped out of the shadows. I thanked the officer, and when I hung up, I closed my eyes, letting exhaustion wash over me. My life was no longer tied to a son who saw me as a balance sheet. My future was no longer endangered by someone who should have been my protector. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't shrinking. I wasn't breaking. I was rising. Because when the law finally knocked on my son's door, one truth echoed louder than any heartbreak. I had chosen myself, and this time, choosing myself might be the very thing that saved my life. What if the moment meant to destroy you becomes the moment you finally discover who you were always meant to be? The next morning, sunlight spilled through the blinds of my small apartment, warm and golden, painting the walls in colors I hadn't appreciated in years. Light used to feel intrusive, almost mocking, breaking into the quiet of a home filled with grief after my husband passed. But today it felt different. Soft, forgiving, like a silent reminder that even after the darkest storms, dawn still arrives. I sat at the little kitchen table with my hands wrapped around a mug of tea, feeling a strange mixture of nerves and calm. Today would change everything. Today I would learn what became of the son who tried to poison me. But beneath the anxiety, beneath the sorrow, beneath the remnants of pain, a new strength thrummed quietly inside me. There comes a moment in every broken person's life when they stop bleeding and start becoming. Just after 9 a.m. the phone rang. I braced myself before answering. It was Howard. His voice was steady, professional, but there was an undertone of gravity that made my heart thud. "They have him," he said. The words echoed through the room. "They have him." My chest tightened, not with grief but with a bittersweet sense of justice. He explained that the officers confronted Robert at his home, that he tried to deny everything at first, that he pretended he had no idea what happened, that he blamed the chocolate company, then the store, then even me for misunderstanding, that he grew frantic when they presented the receipts showing he'd purchased arsenic, that he fell silent when they showed him the drafted legal letters, that the facade of a concerned son collapsed under the weight of cold facts. He was arrested on charges that reflected the gravity of his intent: attempted murder, poisoning, insurance fraud. As Howard spoke, I felt something inside me unclench. Not joy, not triumph. Something quieter. Something cleaner. Closure. But even then, the grief didn't evaporate. How could it? A child is not someone you stop loving, even when they stop loving you. A child is not someone you stop caring for, even when they harm you. A child is a memory stitched into your life, a thread you never imagined you'd have to cut. And yet, here I was, cutting it for the sake of survival. And in that severing, I found something I didn't know I needed: self-respect. Sometimes the cruelest betrayal isn't what someone does to you. It's realizing you allowed them too much room to do it. Later in the afternoon, I visited the hospital again, not for him, but for the people who suffered because of him. My daughter-in-law greeted me with watery eyes, her face still pale but filled with gratitude. The children, though weak, were recovering beautifully. I brought them little stuffed animals and watched as their small hands clutched them with sleepy smiles. In their innocence, they had no idea how close they came to becoming collateral damage in a plan designed for me. I held their tiny fingers gently and made a silent vow they would never again be pawns in someone else's greed. I would make sure of that. And slowly, word spread through the senior support network about what had happened. Women strangers at first approached me with their own stories of manipulation, stories of stolen money, stories of emotional abuse, stories of children who treated their aging parents like burdens instead of blessings. I realized then, painfully, that I wasn't alone. I wasn't the first mother betrayed by her own blood, and I wouldn't be the last. But maybe I could be one of the ones who stopped hiding. One of the ones who fought back. One of the ones who turned their wounds into a weapon for others. Healing is never quiet. It echoes into the lives of those who need it most. With Howard's help, I secured every part of my estate, tightened legal protections, removed access privileges, froze old accounts, opened new ones, and rewrote my will so thoroughly that not even a shadow of manipulation could slip through its pages. Every asset, every property, every financial instrument was locked behind layers of legal protection he would never again touch. But removing him was not the end. It was only the beginning. In the months that followed, I found purpose growing inside me like a new heartbeat. I began volunteering with organizations that supported seniors facing abuse. Physical, financial, emotional. I started speaking at community centers, sharing my story not with shame but with determination. The people I met, elderly women trembling with fear, men who had been robbed by their own children, grandparents abandoned after decades of sacrifice. They looked at me not as a victim, but as a survivor. And one day, while sipping tea in the same kitchen of my temporary apartment, I realized something profound. I didn't just want to help. I wanted to build something bigger, something lasting, something that would outlive both my pain and my fear. So I founded a small non-profit for senior protection and advocacy, just a few volunteers at first, then dozens, then hundreds. We educated families, we created resource networks, we connected lawyers with vulnerable elders. We offered emotional support, legal guidance, and emergency intervention. And slowly, incredibly, the organization grew into something powerful, something meaningful, something that gave women like me a place to reclaim their voices. The legacy my son wanted to steal became the foundation of a legacy he could never touch. Years later, as I stood on stage at a charity gala speaking about resilience, betrayal, and rebirth, I glanced at the front row where my grandchildren sat, safe, thriving, untouched by their father's darkness. And I realized something I never expected. I wasn't defined by the son who tried to kill me. I was defined by the strength I found after he failed. The boy I raised gave me life as his mother. The man he became tried to take it away. But the woman I became built an entire world from the ashes, and if there is anything I have learned, it is this. Sometimes betrayal breaks you wide open, not to destroy you, but to let the strongest version of you finally step into the light. What if the chapter you thought was closed tries to reopen itself, not because you're weak, but because your strength threatens the one who hurt you? In the months following my son's arrest, my life slowly unraveled and rewove itself into a shape I never expected. A tapestry stitched with new purpose, reluctant healing, and the quiet hum of independence. My foundation was growing, gaining donors, building programs, expanding from a local effort into something larger. Newspapers picked up my story, not the gruesome parts, but the transformation. They wrote about the widow who survived poisoning and turned her scars into a mission. Strangers thanked me. Women told me they finally left abusive children, spouses, caretakers. I watched their stories unfold like mirrors held against my own, each one reflecting something familiar: fear, shame, survival, courage. And yet, even as my world brightened, there was a shadow that lingered at the edge of everything. Because healing doesn't erase the past, it simply gives you the strength to face it without collapsing. The wounds you survive will always echo, but if you listen closely, the echoes eventually sound more like warnings than ghosts. I visited the courthouse often, not because I needed to attend hearings, my lawyer advised against it, but because I wanted to understand the system that had once seemed cold and distant. Now it was the very structure holding a broken man accountable. Each time I walked through those heavy doors, the air felt charged with unspoken judgment, whispers, fear, resilience. I saw families torn apart for reasons both heartbreaking and horrifying. I saw parents fighting to prove their sanity, seniors battling financial predators, children caught in custody wars. And I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit until then: my story wasn't an anomaly. My son wasn't the only one who had chosen greed over morality. My suffering wasn't some rare tragedy, it was part of a larger pattern, one that had gone unspoken for too long. Knowing this didn't comfort me, but it armed me, prepared me, focused me. Then, one afternoon, while reviewing program proposals for my foundation, my lawyer called with a tone that instantly stiffened my spine. "Dorothy," he said carefully, "your son has requested a meeting." My heart lurched, a visceral punch of memory, the chocolates, the hospital, the receipts, the arrest. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Why would he want to see me? What did he want? Did he think an apology could rewrite attempted murder? Did he hope I'd feel nostalgia and drop the charges? Or worse, did he still believe he could manipulate me? My silence must have worried Howard, because he added quickly, "You do not have to meet him." In fact, I would advise against it unless you want closure. Closure, a word that sounded so gentle in theory and so dangerous in reality. Closure isn't always a door you walk through. Sometimes it's the lock you finally turn from the outside. I told him I'd think about it, but the thought twisted inside me for days. I didn't want to see my son. I didn't want to hear explanations that would feel like knives or apologies that would feel like traps. But another part of me, the part that had grown sharper, steadier, wiser, felt something else. A need not for conversation, but for confrontation. Not to forgive, but to witness. To look at the man who tried to erase me and prove, silently, that he failed. The meeting was scheduled at the jail in a supervised room. When I walked through the metal detectors, my palms were cold, but my steps were firm. I wore the pendant my husband gave me on our 20th anniversary, something that reminded me of love that had been real, steady and pure. I sat in the visitor's chair, separated by a thick pane of glass, and then they brought him in. My son. His face was thinner, his eyes darker, his movements jittery with the residue of desperation. He sat across from me and lifted the phone. I did the same. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said my name, not Mom, not Mother, just Dorothy, and something cold settled through me like frost creeping along a window pane. He spoke quickly, rambling about misunderstandings, loneliness, financial pressures, how things got out of hand, how he didn't think it would go that far. He begged for leniency, he begged for empathy, he begged for the version of me he used to manipulate. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I sat still, listening without reacting, letting the truth soak into the space between us. He wasn't apologizing for what he'd done. He was apologizing for getting caught. Some people confuse remorse with inconvenience. They're only sorry when consequences arrive. When he finally stopped talking, he asked quietly, "Do you still love me?" It was the only moment that pierced me. Because love doesn't evaporate, not even after betrayal. But love isn't enough to resurrect trust, repair damage, or justify survival at someone else's mercy. I looked at him carefully and said nothing. Silence was my answer. The guard ended the visit. I stood, my legs heavy but steady, and walked away. That was the last time I saw him. Weeks later, he accepted a plea deal. Years behind bars, mandatory counseling. No contact allowed unless I initiated it. And when the judge announced the terms, I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I didn't collapse. I simply breathed deeply, freely, for the first time in what felt like forever. My foundation grew even more after that. I created scholarships for elder survivors, built emergency housing units, partnered with legal aid groups, and launched awareness campaigns. My name no longer felt tied to victimhood. It felt tied to purpose, strength, rebirth. One evening, at a fundraising gala, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes and said, "Your story saved my mother. She hugged me like I was something holy." And in that moment, I understood what part 8 of my life was meant to be, not the trauma, but the transformation. Not the betrayal, but the rebuilding. Not the son I lost, but the hundreds of people I helped save. Because the truth is this, sometimes life breaks you on purpose, not to shatter you, but to reveal the steel inside your soul. And the woman I am now? She was born the day someone tried to end me and failed. What if healing isn't about forgetting the past, but outgrowing the version of yourself that once accepted the pain? In the months after the sentencing, life settled into a new rhythm, a rhythm I never predicted, never imagined, and certainly never believed I could build at nearly 70 years old. Healing didn't happen in grand moments or sudden epiphanies. It was quieter, more patient, more like a tide that returned gently day after day until I noticed the shore had changed. My morning started with coffee on my balcony, the rising sun warming the railing beneath my fingers, the world soft and slow before the day sharpened around its edges. And in those quiet hours, I learned something no one had ever taught me. Surviving wasn't the same as living. Surviving meant waking up because your body demanded it. Living meant waking up because your spirit wanted to. Healing begins the moment your breath stops sounding like a chore. What began as a reluctant step into advocacy became a full-fledged movement. Donations poured in. Volunteers signed up. Women shared their stories publicly for the first time, emboldened by the knowledge that their suffering was not a rare tragedy, but a common wound society often refused to look at. I started traveling, local town halls, community centers, eventually national conferences, speaking about financial exploitation, elder abuse, emotional manipulation, and the silent crises that happen behind perfectly painted doors. Each time I stood behind a podium, my voice grew stronger, steadier, less tethered to the past. And little by little, the world stopped seeing me as the woman whose son tried to poison her and started seeing me as something else entirely, a force, a leader. A survivor with a mission bigger than her pain. When the wound stops defining you, it becomes the reason someone else survives. But growth, real growth, always comes with new challenges, and the challenge that arrived next was one I didn't expect at all. My daughter-in-law reached out one afternoon, her voice trembling with uncertainty. She wanted to talk, not about the case. Those wounds were too raw, too legally tangled. But about the children, about their questions, about their nightmares. She asked if I would consider being involved in their lives again. She said they missed me, that they asked for me, that they looked for me in crowds, that they still remembered my hugs, even though trauma had pressed heavy fingerprints on their tiny shoulders. The moment she asked, tears rushed to my eyes, not because of the pain, but because of the love that still lived stubbornly inside me. I thought losing my son meant losing them too. But here was a bridge being offered back to me, fragile and trembling, but real. The first time I saw the children again, they ran to me with the same unfiltered joy they'd always had. They didn't carry their father's sins, they carried their own innocence. Holding them felt like holding the future, something bright and unbroken. But beneath that joy, a quiet fear whispered in my heart. Would my presence confuse them? Would my son's absence haunt them? Would the world label them as the children of a criminal? I didn't have the answers, but I did know this: loving them was part of my healing, not part of my punishment. And if I could give them stability, warmth, and a kind of safety their father had failed to provide, Then maybe the circle of pain would finally stop turning. Though publicly I stood tall, privately I faced a different challenge: loneliness. Not the sharp, aching loneliness of grief, but the hollow kind that comes after a lifequake, when the dust settles and you realize you don't quite fit into the world you inhabited before. Friends didn't know what to say. Others treated me like a fragile relic, someone to tiptoe around, someone whose story they admired from afar but couldn't hold close without burning themselves. It wasn't malice, just human discomfort. Trauma makes people uncomfortable unless they've walked through their own. Sometimes the pain isn't that people leave, it's that they don't know how to stay anymore. So I made new friendships, slow friendships, intentional friendships, women from support groups, advocates, volunteers, people who spoke the same language of survival, and in them I found community. Not the kind that looks perfect in family photos, but the kind built from shared truths, shared scars, and shared resilience. We laughed loudly, we mourned deeply, we celebrated victories no matter how small. And when I returned home each evening, my apartment didn't feel like a temporary shelter anymore. It felt like a home I had built with my own reborn hands. One day, at a retreat for trauma survivors, a woman asked me a question that caught me completely off guard. "Do you forgive him?" The room fell silent. I breathed in slowly, letting the question settle in the space between us. Forgiveness is a complicated thing, a word often weaponized, often misunderstood. Forgiveness, in many ways, is a currency individuals use to absolve others before healing themselves. But I didn't owe my forgiveness to him. I owed my peace to myself. So I answered honestly. "I forgive the child he once was," I said. "I forgive the boy who held my hand, but I do not forgive the man who tried to end my life. That forgiveness is not mine to give. It belongs to whatever future he chooses behind bars. Forgiveness is not about releasing someone else from their sins. It's about releasing yourself from their power." And just like that, something in my chest loosened. It wasn't closure. It wasn't acceptance. It was liberation. The final turning point came unexpectedly. While sorting through old photos for a slideshow at a fundraiser, I found a picture of myself from decades ago, smiling, radiant, untouched by tragedy. A younger version of me who had no idea what storms awaited her. I stared at that photo for a long time before realizing something startling. The woman I am now is stronger, wiser, braver, and more grounded than the smiling woman in the picture ever had to be. Because healing isn't about returning to who you were before the pain. It's about becoming someone who could never again be destroyed by it. What if the moment you reclaim your life becomes the moment the world realizes you were never the victim in your story, you were the warning? Life expanded in ways I never imagined after the retreat, after the reunions, after the fragile threads of healing began weaving themselves into something whole. The foundation didn't just grow, it flourished. Women who had once whispered into the dark now stood on stages, telling their truths with trembling hands but steady voices. Elder abuse survivors wrote letters thanking me for lighting a path they could finally walk on. Journalists began requesting interviews not because they wanted to sensationalize my trauma, but because they wanted to understand the larger epidemic behind it. Suddenly, my name wasn't attached to survival alone. It was attached to change, legislation, awareness. It was strange, almost unsettling, how a life once defined by quiet routines and family dinners had shifted into a public mission. Sometimes the tragedy that almost ends you becomes the reason someone else lives. One morning, my lawyer forwarded an email from the State Senate Committee. They wanted me to testify at a legislative hearing as the lead advocate for a bill strengthening protections for elderly citizens. Something inspired partly by my case, partly by the hundreds of others that rarely made headlines. My first reaction was disbelief. Why me? Why my voice? Why my story? And yet, beneath the disbelief, a steady pulse began to beat, a hum of purpose. Maybe surviving wasn't the end of my story. Maybe speaking was. I agreed to testify. Howard prepared me, walking me through statements, legal language, and statistics that were stomach-churning in their truth. And when the day arrived, I stepped through the marble pillars of the Capitol, feeling Jake's presence like a hand on my back, steadying me in a world so much larger than the kitchen where he once kissed my forehead. The chamber was full lawmakers, reporters, survivors, lobbyists, strangers who didn't know me but knew the weight of my story. When I began speaking, my voice cracked, not with fear, but with gravity. I told them about the boxes of chocolates meant to kill me. I told them about my son's confession, my daughter-in-law's screams at the hospital, the betrayal that took root long before poison ever entered my bloodstream. I told them about the thousands of seniors manipulated, abandoned, financially exploited in silence. And when I ended with, "No mother should need a miracle to survive her own child," the room held its breath. Power isn't loud. Sometimes it whispers so softly the world has no choice but to lean closer. After the hearing, reporters swarmed, microphones flashing like strobe lights. But amid the chaos, one woman stepped forward, a journalist whose eyes carried a softness I recognized. She said, "Mrs. Hayes, I want to tell your story the way it deserves to be told. Not sensationalized, not dramatized, respected, documented." She asked if she could write a feature, maybe even a book. The idea unsettled me. Exposing my son publicly felt like ripping an old wound open. But then I thought of the women who reached out to me, the ones who whispered, "Your story is my story." If telling mine saved even one, then maybe the pain had purpose. I agreed. That night, sitting alone on my balcony with the city lights flickering below, I realized something profound. I had stepped out of my survival story and into my legacy story. And that shift felt like breathing sunlight. But true life, never moves in one clean direction. Healing grows, yes, but so does scrutiny. A few critics appeared online, strangers calling me dramatic, attention-seeking, a woman who must have driven her son to madness. At first, their words stung, then they angered me. But eventually, I understood something essential. People attack what threatens their illusions. My story forced society to look at the ugly truth, that abuse doesn't always come from strangers in shadows. Sometimes it comes from the very people you raised. If the truth makes someone uncomfortable, it isn't the truth that needs changing, it's the comfort. And then came the unexpected twist. During a follow-up legal review of my case, investigators uncovered something they hadn't noticed before, a bank account, one I didn't recognize. One opened in my name but accessed entirely by my son. Transfers, withdrawals, forged signatures, evidence that his betrayal didn't begin with the chocolates. It began months earlier, maybe years. The prosecutor contacted me personally to share the findings. My stomach dropped. The betrayal reached deeper than I knew. But instead of breaking me, the revelation rooted me in something stronger than pain. Certainty that walking away wasn't cruelty. It was survival. Feeling the weight of this new truth, I visited the prison for the last time. Not to speak to him, not to console him, but to deliver a formal statement blocking any attempts for early release. Not out of revenge, out of protection, out of clarity. Out of the knowledge that some wounds heal best when distance becomes permanent. As I left the facility, breathing crisp afternoon air, a strange sense of closure settled over me. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but a final, steadying acceptance. My son had made choices, and I had made mine. Months later, the bill I testified for passed unanimously. My foundation received a national award. The book about my story was published and became a tool for social workers, senior advocates, and caregivers everywhere. And at the launch event, a young woman approached me with her mother, frail, trembling, but alive. "Your story saved her," she whispered, and in that moment I understood the true ending of everything I'd lived through. Not the betrayal, not the poison, not the courtroom, but the lives changed because I refused to stay silent. Because sometimes the darkest thing you survive becomes the brightest thing you give to the world, and no betrayal, no matter how deep, can erase the woman you rise into.